public session. Apologies have been received from Deputy Bailey. You're all welcome to this meeting of the Joint Committee on Employment Affairs and Social Protection. Before I begin, I'd remind members, if you have mobile phones, you might turn them either to flight mode or turn them off completely. In accordance with standard procedures agreed by the Committee on Procedure and Privileges for paperless committees, all documentation for the meeting has been circulated to members on the document database, and the Minister's opening statement, for anybody who hasn't got a copy, there are copies here. The purpose of today's meeting is to afford the Minister for Employment Affairs and Social Protection to comment on the Intercon report for local employment services and jobs, the Jobs Club. I'll invite the Minister in a few moments to make an opening statement, and then members will have an opportunity to raise questions with her. Before that, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to the Committee. However, if you're directed by the Committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you're entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. And members are reminded of the long-standing practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Okay, Minister, thank you for attending today. You do realise this is a two-part process. We had witnesses on this issue. I'm sure you've seen their presentation from earlier in the week, and in the context of the points they raised and the presentation they made, we were, I suppose, interested in your comments on the matters as they presented them.
Thank you, and thank you and the members for the invitation to discuss the Intercon reports that we published earlier on this year. And also I'm looking forward to the questions that you would have for me later on arising from the presentation of the ILDN earlier on this week. But before discussing the report, I think it would be useful to give a brief overview of the evolution of policy and practice in this area of activation and the direction that these reforms have taken. So the period from 2011 to 2019 has seen significant reforms in government's approach to supporting people who are unemployed and in their return to the labour market. And the changes have included streamlining and reorganisation of the services on offer from our own department through our NGO services, the introduction of new services and schemes, including recruitment subsidies such as Jobs Plus, work placements under Jobs Bridge, tailored training under the Momentum programme and conversion education under the Springboards programme, an increase in the number of case officers both directly employed and indirectly provided via contract to offer services, the tailoring of my department's approach to job seekers using the model which was developed by the ESRI, and increasing the numbers of places on and adjusting the approach taken with the state employment schemes such as community employment, TUS, RSS, etc. My department have also developed an employer engagement strategy and a team to work very closely with employers in initiatives such as Jobs Plus and National Jobs Week, which ran very successfully last week. And I want to just pay tribute to all of the organisers and the event participants, because it really was a success last week. And in all of these initiatives, we applied the principle of rights and responsibilities to encourage people in receipt of payments for job seeking to actively engage with all or some of our services. And all of these changes were developed and implemented as part of the Pathways to Work strategy based on expert research and advice such as we received from the bodies of the OECD, the ESRI and NESC. And of particular relevance is the 2009 OECD report on activation policies in Ireland, the 2010 ESRI report on employment services and the 2011 NESC report on services and supports for job seekers. The changes were overseen and guided by the Labour Market Council, comprised of experts such as Dr. John Martin, who is the former Head of Employment and Social Affairs at the OECD, Professor Philip O'Connell of UCD, Bríd O'Brien of the INOU, Dr. John Sweeney of NESC, Dr. Peter Rigney of ICTU, Tony Donoghue of IBEC, together with senior leaders from a large number of employers. And the changes have not only borne fruit, but have been in the main warmly welcomed by the job seekers that we serve. The evidence for this can be seen in the reductions in unemployment and in particular long-term unemployment as we emerged from the recession that lasted from 2009 to 2013. This labour market recovery differs markedly from that witnessed in Ireland following previous recessions, or indeed what was witnessed in other countries affected from the global crisis that we suffered on the hands of 2009-2013. And in previous recessions, it took over 6 years of sustained economic growth for unemployment to start responding, and even longer for long-term unemployment to fall. And this time around, Ireland's experience was different. And although it's difficult to attribute this performance in a quantitative way to the specific actions and measures, there is some evidence that the committee could possibly consider. Econometric studies of Jobs Bridge, the Back to Work Education Allowance and Jobs Path, together with a value for money review of Jobs Plus, all indicated a very positive impact on employment outcomes for participants in comparison to non-participants. And the recently published ESRI econometric assessment of the streamlined in-trio process commissioned by my own department indicates that the reforms improved exits from the live register, which obviously was our aim. And furthermore, external commentary on the Irish economy by the OECD, the EU and the IMF have singled out our activation reforms as being particularly effective in contributing to reducing unemployment. Reviews of the in-trio processes reforms by the INOU and by the network of European Pillar Employment Services have also been positive, Chair. But perhaps most importantly, our customer satisfaction tracking research, commissioned externally and conducted independently, indicates very high levels of customer satisfaction with the service and the services offered. And all of this evidence suggests that we do not need to implement major reforms in our approach to activation. We now operate in line with best practice internationally, and that's not to say that we can't do better, and we will do better, and in particular that there are not changes that we need to make to adjust to our improving economic situation. And I think it's in this context that the two Indicon reviews on local employment services and jobs clubs were published last January will have to be considered. I think members of the committee would agree that the reviews are broadly positive regarding the impacts of LESs and jobs clubs, recognising the role that LESs play in engaging with those furthest from the labour market, as well as the useful role of jobs club working with people who are more job ready, some of those clients. But nonetheless, the Indicon reviews does make several useful recommendations that are being considered by the department. Transitioning to multi-annual contracts from the current annual contract, as suggested in the review, would enable contractors to plan for the medium term, while the enhanced use of performance metrics would enable my department to ensure that the performance of contracted employment services are to the benefit to job seekers and value to the taxpayer. And in relation to procurement, the Indicon review suggests that open or more public competitive procurement be actively considered. And a move to competitive procurement is also consistent with the legal advice that my department has received with regard to its obligations under EU procurement legislation. So accordingly, this is a matter that's currently receiving active consideration. Last December, Chair, I had the genuine privilege of travelling to meet and addressing the ILDN conference, where I informed the delegates of the Indicon reports and the fact that they would be published in early January. There were obviously some concerns and nervousness, I suppose, around the fact that they hadn't seen it yet. But senior officials, and we assured them that day that they'd nothing to be nervous about, and that once the reports were issued, that we would meet and sit and talk to them. So senior officials from my department have met with the representatives of the LESs and the jobs clubs on the 25th of January shortly after the publication of the reviews. And they were joined by a partner from Indicon who was responsible for drafting the reviews, who presented the findings to the ILDN members and took their questions. The LESs and the Jobs Club have broadly welcomed the Indicon reviews, and I'm happy to say are positively engaging with the department, as they always have done. The continued longevity and success of LES and Jobs Club cannot be based on standing still or an assumption that the contracts will be renewed irrespective of legal requirements or service performance considerations. And from our discussions, it's clear that the LESs and the Jobs Clubs understand that they need to adapt to the ever-changing circumstances that exist. And I think it's encouraging to see their openness to change and reform, and I'm optimistic that we're going to continue to benefit from their expertise, their experience and their services for many, many years to come. Chair, as you're well aware, an econometric review of the Job Path service by the Department Statistics Unit, led by a senior statistician on secondment from the CSO, with support and input from the OECD, is very near completion, and I expect the results to be published next week. I also note that some commentators have sought to present the service procured via Job Path as somehow in competition with that procured via LESs and Jobs Club. And to be honest with you, the simplistic presentation, as it has been put to me on numerous occasions, is misplaced. So I just want to be very clear to say that the view of myself, but it's very much shared by the people in the department who were there long before me and who will be there long after me, right, is that these services complement rather than compete with each other. And I think the evidence in Ireland, just as in every other labour market around the world, is that people who are long-term unemployed face significant challenges in securing employment opportunities. And for some long-term unemployed people, the period of unemployment is prolonged, and this requires that there need be a mix of service and service providers in order to help them over this period. And that's why we have LESs, Jobs Club, Jobs Path, state employment schemes such as CE, TUS and RSS, and a mixture of education and training services through our Solace and other contracted service providers. And services which can, at different stages of unemployment, offer different opportunities and supports to unemployed job seekers. I think the truth of the matter is that right now we have about 77,000 people still on the live register long-term unemployed. And we have a further approximately 45,000 people who are on our programmes such as CE. So I know there may be a fear that there's a particular mindset here, but there's absolutely, unfortunately, more than enough unemployed people for all of our services to help, because we wouldn't be able to do what we need to do to support those people without the support of all of our services. So if I'm looking to the future, the development of our service strategy will be driven by a twin purpose at the core of all public employment services. And first of all, the activation function of the public employment service is to facilitate the smooth functioning of the labour market by encouraging labour market participation and by reducing what economists call friction as people enter, leave or move between jobs within the workforce. It does this by trying to ensure that unemployed workers are matched through advice, counselling, work experience and training to job opportunities, and to ensure that the job opportunities are in fact notified to and made available to job seekers. Activation also means, Chair, working with employers to make it easy for them to take on the workers and specifically to encourage them to give unemployed workers a chance whom they might not otherwise consider, and the opportunity for these people to prove their worth and to continue to work in those organisations where they get work experience. The second core purpose of public employment services is social inclusion, and that's to ensure that unemployed workers are not disenfranchised by not having a social or family capital or network that gives them access to employment opportunities. And I suppose, stating simply enough, it's not enough for the state to passively provide income supports and then leave people on their own to figure out what they're going to do and how they're going to help themselves. We need to help people find and sustain employment, and we have a duty to offer supports in the form of advice, work experience, opportunities, training and education and occupational activities to all job seekers. In doing this, we provide a social capital or a public network to all unemployed workers that can help redress any inequality arising from all differences in social and family capital. And the twin purpose of activation and social inclusion applies regardless of the economic backdrop. However, the challenges faced in delivering on this purpose changes as employment conditions vary. We are at this stage moving from a position of having excess supply of labour to where of labour is tightening. And this challenges to create opportunities to bring more people into the labour market and to extend our services to other groups of people who we couldn't reach given constrained resources during recessionary times. And this will include improving and expanding services for women not currently active in the workplace but who want to be, and similarly for people who have a disability and want to be active. We're also moving from a position where many unemployed people have a strong record of prior employment to one where those people who are now long-term unemployed are increasingly characterised by weak labour market attachment and significant employment barriers. This group of people requires more intensive support delivered via a mixture of services and service providers, as I've already outlined. The Department is currently reviewing how it will adapt its services to address these challenges. As we already mentioned, it's unlikely to require a major overhaul of our service provision, but it will require a refocusing of our effort and more than likely some redesign of our services to attune them to the needs of people facing significant barriers of taking up unemployment. We are now in the process of what I hope will be designing the activation support services for the next generation of people, and whilst we're lucky enough at the moment for our numbers to be coming down, they need to be scalable so that, God forbid, if anything ever happens, unemployment in this country ever again, that we need to be able to scale them up easily. And some of the changes that we've made in the design of the YES scheme, for argument's sake, which supports young people with significant barriers to employment to gain valuable work experience, is an example of the redesigning of some of our schemes that were working, but just with a small number of tweaks can hopefully have a much more positive impact. But one thing I will not do is make the mistake that was made by previous administrations with respect to them. In periods of economic growth, when the state's public employment services were allowed to, in effect, wind down and wither through disuse because we didn't need them, without any acknowledgement of that, we would need to be able to turn on the tap again. What we do not want in any future economic downturn in the economic cycle is to have to start to rebuild from scratch the public employment services, as we did unfortunately have to do in 2011 to 2015. Because although we've had major success, I think there's absolutely no doubt that we lost too much time in rebuilding the service, leading to a situation where we entered the recession with far, far more people unemployed than would have been if we had the public employment services operating effectively for the previous number of years. And an estimate from the OECD in 2009 suggested that the live register was at a level of about 100,000 people more than it would have been if our employment services were operating to best practice levels in those years. So in refocusing our efforts, Chair, I will not countenance any reduction in capacity. Between our Intrio, our LESs, our Jobs Path staff, we have approximately 800 case officers at present, and I intend as a minimum to maintain that level of capacity to the extent that I can, given available resources, and extend the Department's service offerings to help other groups, people with disabilities and people, mainly women, who left employment to mind our children, access employment opportunities in the future. So I believe these objectives are something that I hope we can all agree on, and I look forward to hearing your views and answering your questions, Chair.
Thank you very much, Minister, for a comprehensive opening statement. Deputy Brady, do you have questions?
Yeah, I have a few observations and indeed a few questions the Minister wouldn't be surprised to hear. So, yeah, I was eagerly awaiting the opening statement. I know it arrived late this afternoon, so I had a read through it with some interest. So, thanks to the Minister for coming in and I suppose presenting the opening statement and taking questions, because there is an awful lot of concern out there, and I know you said you have engaged with the ILDN, and you know there's positive engagement there, but there's also a lot of fear, and that fear was echoed when we had representatives from the ILDN in before the committee, and indeed representatives from SIP2 also. There's some real concerns there as to the future for the LES and indeed job clubs. And I think the one thing that the Indicon report does show is that, you know, the massive success that they have been, and you know, some of the stats that jump out in 2012, when we had an unemployment rate of 16%, it dropped to 6.7. It dropped 6.7% before the onset of job pass. So it showed clearly the successful schemes that were there were actually making a massive impact in terms of addressing the unemployment crisis that we had at that point. So, as the Minister says, you know, Job Pass is, you know, being the most successful labour activation scheme in the history of the state, and besides the drop in unemployment figures, you know, the drop had actually started, and that had been brought on by the successful schemes that are in place. The Indicon report also shows that you know, the LES achieved a 28.8% achievement rate, you know, where the target was 30%. Now, you know, quite concerning is that the department, the Minister, doesn't take into account that that is only you know, achievement where people go into jobs in excess of 30 hours, so it doesn't take into account people who are engaged in part-time employment or employment less than 30. It doesn't actually take into account people who have gone into education or upskilling or training or anything like that. So I'd say the achievement rate is considerably higher than the 28.8% that is listed there. And if you compare that to the alternative scheme that the Minister cites, Job Pat, where the target there was 14%, and you know, I think they still actually struggle to achieve that, even though you see the amount of money that has been put into the Job Pat programme, Tourist New and CTEC, over 162 million, and only over 11,000 jobs, people being sustained in employment for 12 months or more. And so I suppose in our engagement and my engagement with the ILDN, there's been a number of concerns that they have raised. Yes, they acknowledge there needs to be some changes. I think they will openly state that they're not afraid of change. They're not afraid of adapting. They know they can't stand still. So the one thing, the recommendation that jumps out at me from the Indicon report was the move to competitive procurement. And I just want to tease that out with the Minister, because reading through her opening statement, she says a move to competitive procurement is also consistent with legal advice my department has received with regard to its obligations under EU procurement legislation. So I would be interested in actually seeing that legal advice that the Minister has got, because the ILDN cited a number of different examples where there was specific I can't find it here now, but there was specific, I suppose, pieces of work, programmes that were allowed to proceed without actually having to go to open procurement, competitive procurement. So, and if you have a look at the EU guidelines on competitive competition policy and rules pertaining to state aid, if you have a look under the EU procurement environment while still protecting services of general interest. I just quote it here. It states, services of general interest expressly include services provided directly to the person, such as social assistance services, employment and training services, childcare, social housing or long-term care of the elderly and people with disabilities. So it shows that we don't have to go out for procurement. The guidelines are there, so I'd be interested to see the actual legal advice that the Minister is talking about in that regard. When you say that the services complement rather than compete against each other, and there's another line here that there is more than enough work for all our service providers. That's interesting because, and I've challenged the Minister on this time and time again. If you have a look at CE, schemes the length and breadth of the state where they're struggling, there's massive amounts of vacancies within our CE schemes right across the entire state. And the Minister, of course, will say because there's less unemployment, there's not enough people to fill them and all that. That's nonsense, because if you have a look at the number of referrals over to JobPat, it continues to grow. Over 206,000 people now referred over to JobPat, not just once, not just twice, but now we have people being referred over for the third year to JobPat, essentially doing the exact same thing time and time again. Of course, the referral fee, the initial referral fee of €311 was paid not just once, not just twice, but 3 times for doing the exact same thing. So, there is a complete competition there that people are being referred to JobPat, and that is at the unfortunately impacting on those schemes. There's a couple of other interesting lines here, Minister, and I just want to touch on them here. You say, as mentioned, this is unlikely to require a major overhaul of service provision, but it will require refocusing on effort. And so if you could just tease that out a little bit, what exactly you're talking about, because there's another line here where you say between intro, LES, JobPat staff, we have approximately 800 case officers at present. So the contract for JobPat, Thursnua and CTEC, that is up this year. Are you clearly stating that there's a role for JobPat into the future? So are you stating that there will be a renewed contract with JobPat, with Thursnua and CTEC? And if that is the case, obviously you would be aware that there's a cross-party Dáil motion calling for the complete end of referrals over to JobPat and solely investing in the schemes such as LES and Job Club and the other successful schemes. So are you clearly stating here now that there is a role for JobPat into the future, Thursnua and CTEC? And I suppose the one question I do want to ask, because this is where there is major concern, it's around the type of model that you are talking about, with the tweaking that goes ahead. If you are intent on putting this out to open procurement, as to what your intentions are. Because the fear here is that you're moving away from the not-for-profit community model, the model that works, and moving to a more privatised model. And that is the real concern within the LES and the job clubs, that you're moving to a payment by results model, a privatised model, moving it away from the community. So I'll ask you a direct question as to whether that is the intention, because this is the real fear, the real concern, that the payment by results model simply does not work. The model that does work is the not-for-profit, the LES, based within the community, the wraparound services that they provide in terms of the upskilling, the further education, and all the other things that aren't actually taken into account when their achievements are actually considered by yourself, Minister. So I'd appreciate some answers to some of those questions. There's a pile more that
we might get back to
get
that, but before that, Senator Nash.
Thank you very much, Chair. And like the Deputy, I mean, I would be concerned at any prospect of the tendering out and the entering into a public procurement scenario for labour activation services. I mean, even if you and your officials were minded to, over a period of time, to go down that route, my own advice would be that it's something that you should reflect on, and indeed, when you receive and reflect on the review that has been undertaken into the Operation Job Path, I think maybe a lot might be discerned from that might inform your approach to this and that of your officials as well. I'm not convinced myself, like the Deputy and like many others, that there is a necessary requirement to go to public procurement, go through a public tendering process to obtain these services. And similarly, I would like to, if not receive directly copies of the legal advice that is informing your at least current position on this, but then if you could elucidate a little bit more on the nature of that advice, I think that would be very, very useful. We had a very interesting debate in the channel yesterday on a bill from a member of this committee, Senator Alice Mary Higgins. I think a very timely piece of legislation which is designed really to ensure that our public contracting, public procurement system in this country emphasises to a greater degree social, economic and labour, social, environmental and labour responsibilities. And I think it's important that we reflect on those issues when we are tendering, particularly on something as significant as this, and also to ensure that if it is a case that you are minded to go to public tender for these kinds of services, that those tenders are designed very, very carefully so as not to exclude, accidentally or otherwise, organisations that are well equipped and well experienced in terms of providing these very, very important services, because we all know that tenders are often designed to obtain the result that the system may want. And I'd ask you just to elaborate a little, if you can, Minister, on the timeline that you envisage for tendering, if you are so minded to tender for activation services of this nature, because I think that would really focus our minds and everybody else's minds on the horizon ahead. There is more than adequate information available from the Indicon report, I think, to allow and make an argument for and justify the sustainment of the LES and Job Club model into the future, particularly when we look at the very still considerable number of households in this country that have no adult that's working. Something I know that does concern you, Minister, concerns me, and it concerns anybody with any interest in the idea of work and the value of work in our society. It seems to me to be very clear indeed, as clear as the nose in our collective faces, that the LES and Jobs Club model is the model that's best placed to deliver the kinds of customised and tailored services that those who are very distant from the labour market require. And it seems to me as well that the payment by results model, which seems to me to be entirely driven by the profit motive, that is not well positioned in any person's language to provide the kinds of wraparound and customised services that LES and Job Club and the Jobs Clubs are renowned for providing. What we have as well with LES and Jobs Clubs is something that money can't buy. It's that institutional memory, that expertise built up over many, many years. The Endicon report itself shows very clearly that the LES operations across the country have very strong relationships with local employers. Employers who were interviewed as part of this process demonstrated that their experience with the local employment service and jobs clubs were very, very important and very useful for them in terms of identifying employees for their organisations. That in itself, I think, is a very compelling and convincing argument for the LES type model to be allowed to sustain. I think it's crucial that we have a community-based response with all of the kinds of things that LES Jobs Club do into the future to reach those people who are of concern to me, and I think of concern to you as well, Minister. Those who are very distant from the labour market, those who, for a variety of different social and economic reasons, often experience intergenerational unemployment in their homes and their families, and we know that so many people who we all deal with on an individual basis, day to day, in terms of our work in our own communities, who are victims of those unfortunate circumstances. So I would just, in conclusion, Minister, ask you to just reflect particularly on my earlier comments around public tendering, around the legal position, and ask you again, even if you are minded and your department is minded to enter into a public procurement process to obtain labour activation services of this nature, then at the very least my advice to you would be to wait until you have the job path review in your hand. Wait till you consider that, because that experience, I think, should inform the way we move in terms of the provision of future labour activation services in this country.
Thank you, Senator Nash. Senator Higgins, do you want to speak now, or do you, just bear with me one moment, or do you want a moment to see the Minister's opening statement, or have you heard it?
I've read the report, but I can take a moment if it's appropriate.
Well, if you want a quick
the
look
Minister
at
wishes to respond
no,
to the
well,
questions.
I'll just make a comment or two if you, and you may want to have a quick look at the opening statement. Minister, I've raised the issue which you have often referred to, long-term unemployment and the issues and the challenges facing there. I suppose the first thing I'd comment is that in relation to reports, and there are many reports on what we've done in the past, lots and lots of statistics in terms of, numbers of people who are unemployed, number of percentages who got jobs, costs associated and so forth. And I suppose one of the things that I often reflect on is that it's very quantitative, but the quality of jobs and so forth and the aspirations of people often aren't seen in parallel or aren't in the reports. We spend a lot of time just looking at the raw numbers. And then we talk about what we've done over the last number of years, and I'm not passing criticism on that in any way, but I am saying the challenge that we're looking at for the next few years, it's a different ballgame altogether. And what worked in the past and what we did isn't going to be fit for purpose. We need more. The group of people that we're looking at now are people who are long-term unemployed. In many areas, they come from geographic areas which would be referred to as areas of black spots of high unemployment. They've had that tag attached to them for a long, long time. And then you have intergenerational in terms of families. So the issue we're looking at is somewhat different. And we're also, I suppose, in a situation where significantly we have employers who now have positions they're unable to fill. So our programme for the future needs to be much more than just presenting an individual to fill a vacancy, because the capacity of the individual to fill that vacancy has to be examined. So I suppose the first observation I'd make in terms of whatever the new programme comes out like, it has to be more holistic. It has to deal with the challenge of the preparation of the person who may well, and I know many people who are in their mid-20s who have never worked, and they're out of school. They may not have done even transition year. They're out of school 10 or 12 years. They're not work ready. They have there is work. In other words, you could present them with an opportunity, but they haven't the experiences. They're out of education, and so there's a lot more challenges for that type of person, and the new programme needs to reflect that. And it needs to go more than just the focus on employment itself. As I said to you before, you know, we need, and I take it fully, Minister, your responsibility is employment affairs and social protection, but this issue has to be addressed in a whole of government way. And that includes education as well, the role of DEIS schools, ensuring, and I know you have an element to play because you refer to it often yourself in terms of school meals and so forth, but there needs to be really well coordinated. We still have a situation where the outcomes for children attending DEIS schools are not equal to those non-DEIS schools. So we have an array of challenges and they have to be dealt with, in my view, holistically. And while getting a person a job is one goal, the goals have to be much more than that. The quality of job, the community they come from. This isn't just about addressing the needs of an individual. It's not just the individual, it's the family they belong to, it's the communities they come from, and it is a much more difficult task than what we've done over the last number of years, in my view. There is a lot more. One comment, and it's a specific comment in relation to one of the recommendations, where it says, reflecting the decline in the number of individuals who are experiencing long-term unemployment, and given the role of other measures, including Job Path, in assisting this group, we recommend that local employment services should in the future focus on most disadvantaged activation and other client groups who are not currently obtaining assistance from other state-delivered funding programmes. I'd be careful with the last bit, because just because somebody is in a programme at the moment, it mightn't be the appropriate programme. And I think we need to be careful that, you know, as we set up a new activation to deal with long-term unemployed, just because somebody is already in a programme, it's a programme that exists today, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity that exists today, but it may not be the best fit for their needs, and they shouldn't automatically be excluded. And I would just have an air of caution around that as we design the new programme. They're my opening observations. Senator Higgins?
Yes, thank you very much, and apologies to have to join the committee late. We had a debate in the Seanad. I think there is much that's very positive in the Indicon report, and there's a lot of really detailed breaking down of what we've already been knowing and hearing from the different testimonies that have come before the committee. I want to really just focus on mainly on the benefits of the LES, and I might touch on Job Path, but I want to focus more on the actual schemes we're reviewing. Minister, you'll be aware yesterday I brought a public procurement bill through the Seanad through second stage, and it has a long journey to go. But what actually started my interest in that area initially was when Job Path was being proposed, because I remember being told at the time by somebody from the department, and I was a civil society representative at the time, that we had to do it because of the European directives. And I kind of went and looked at the European directives and where they were coming and how they were changing, and saw that there was actually huge scope within them. And there is huge scope within them. So while much of the analysis of the report is so strong and robust, what did come back, and it came very strongly in our hearings earlier this week, is that the recommendation for necessarily competitive open procurement being the best, you know, that it should be considered, felt like a non sequitur, that the case wasn't made for it. And there is scope, as has been made, in terms of the services of general interest. There is scope for the model of delivery that we have at the moment to continue or to be enhanced, and that we don't necessarily need to move to an open procurement model. And I think I think it's really important that you, Minister, give and that the department allow this model to be developed further, because I think the ultimate tests should be around the outcomes, and absolutely they should be monitored. But the competitive process has not always delivered the best outcomes for us. And certainly some of the very blunt measures, like the 30% target, doesn't really capture some of the positive work that has been done. So we know already that the LES has hit 28.8%. You know, they're almost hitting the 30%. But what really struck me was that both Jobs Club and the local employment services, that was the measure of over 30 hours. But the huge number of people who were also moving into maybe less than 30 hours work But that was a really important step for them in terms of their progression, in terms of building labour market attachment. It may have been persons, for example, who were also balancing care, and they were looking at the 15 hours childcare. So I think, for example, the way we measure it at the moment doesn't maybe capture those who may be only working 20 hours or 15 hours, but it's a really important step back into the market to them. The other things that I think were really strong when we heard from the local employment services is the recognition that there are multiple other positive outcomes. So again, jobs is one outcome, but Minister, we've discussed this, and I know that you understand this issue because we've engaged with it in the past. A return to education is also a very positive outcome. And again, that's something that Job Path, in terms of their contract down to the local employment services, have made very strong connections with universities. And again, it may not hit that 30% target, but it's a really important outcome. And it's that texture of outcome and the responsiveness that local employment services have shown to a changing landscape that I think is one of the great strengths. And when you have services that are not for profit, they are able to be more responsive than services that have not only you as their client to engage with in terms of the department, but also shareholders with projected exact income and exact returns every week. They don't have that flexibility. And when we talk, I know that the long-term unemployed numbers have decreased, but there are other cohorts. Those who may not be on the live register, Minister, as we know, those who may be lone parents, parenting alone, who may have young children but may want on a voluntary basis to access services. And I was very struck, for example, that those who would probably be qualified adults in the system had found support from local employment services. So that's maybe jobless households where someone might not be on the register at all, but was able to engage and get supports in that regard. And similarly, those with disabilities and particular programmes in that regard. I think there's huge scope in that regard, Minister. And again, it's very important that that wider scope of potentially interested in people who may have a slightly longer route to employment, who may need particular supports, that is in a positive frame and not in any sense in a punitive or a sanction-based frame. Local employment services can do that. And again, Minister, we debated, I stepped into the Climate Change Committee just as I went into public session and voting, which was an interesting experience. But one of the big issues that was debated was when we talk about support in just transition for those in carbon-intensive industries, as that changes, people wanted to know that it's not simply going to be a job path model, but that it'll be a joined-up model. And again, the local employment services are exactly, and the jobs clubs, exactly the kind of measure and space for things like transitioning, because what they've talked about is that they have had the scope in the past and could in the future of working with those who are not unemployed yet, who may be in precarious work or maybe in sectors that are downscaling. And that's a huge potential that is there again. And I think just the evidence, I'm not going to go back into all the evidence of how they work, but I'm talking more about the potential for the future. I think, as the Chair very eloquently said, we face a new set of challenges now. I think that the local employment services, the jobs clubs, are the kind of appropriate tool for what we face into and the complexity. And I really feel that we have a danger of losing some of that if we move to an open, competitive model, frozen in time, where we sign up to a 5-year contract and we have a certain number of people attached. Almost that flexibility in response could be lost. So again, I kind of feel like we should scale these up. And the last point I would say, something that's really good about the model at the moment, and I worked with Wexford Local Development, with young rural unemployed people in the past myself. What was really wonderful is that they listened collectively to those young people around how they felt the system could work better. What a rural youth guarantee might look like. You know, that there was an openness and a social benefit and a conversation, which is different when you feel that you have an axe hanging over your head and how many CVs have you sent out, that people were feeding back, and so that the system itself was responding. And again, I know this is basically a paean to the local employment services and jobs clubs, but I believe, Minister, this is what we need for the future, and I hope that you're going to be able to kind of tell us how this is going to translate into a massive scaling up, and maybe specifically those education links again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. Minister, a number of issues there for you to address, and I suppose some of them were very specific, so you might pay attention.
I'll try and answer them in a round, and then the specific direct questions that I was asked, I'll answer them, and if there's any that I've missed from my notes, then just shout, okay? I think the one thing that's very obvious is the appreciation that we all have of the services that the LESs and the jobs clubs have offered to probably hundreds of thousands of people over the years that they've been established. We're very grateful and appreciative of the services that they've helped us deliver, and we've no intentions of downsizing or changing in the negative anything that they do. And so if I can synopsise maybe what I'm hearing from all of you is that you're happy in the knowledge that it's part of the service offering that we need in the future. We value the experience and the expertise and the tailoring kind of services that they've been offered that you so eloquently described, Mary. So it's something that we want to take advantage of in the future. And I think, John, you have hit the nail on the head when you talk about the fact that when we develop the next generation of services, it has to be cognizant of the fact that the challenges that some people are facing today weren't even around 10 or 15 years ago. So the new services models that we have, and it is an array of services, and can I please tell you, they're not in competition with each other. We don't sit down and go, oh, JobsPath is better than CE, because they're not. They're different. And actually, that's what we need to model going forward, is that no two organisations, whether they're contracted, our own people, host companies, JobsPath, whatever they are, and however they are contracted to the state to provide services on behalf of the state, that they're not doing the same job. That we actually specifically recognise the skills and the talents and the capabilities of each individual organisation, and to send different sections of society that have different challenges to the people that are most receptive to helping them get through that particular period in their life. And for some time in an unemployed person's life it might be CE, and then they might move from CE to being CV ready to, it may be that they will move from one service to another service over the lifetime of their unemployment, but I genuinely hope that the lifespan of their unemployment gets smaller and smaller and smaller, because we're aware of the changing factors and social difficulties that people are facing in this generation, and that we tailor and model our services going forward. And so the only thing I can absolutely guarantee, and I think Johnny gave me the opportunity last week to reiterate, that the budgets for all of our contracted services have not changed. Our intention is to model the services from a tailored perspective going forward for the next activation services that the state offers, using the people, the experience and the expertise that we currently have in place. And Les's and our Jobs Club make and form a huge and integral part of that offering going forward. And so if I go back and answer maybe some of the specific, and I'm as grateful, as most of you are, and I said it to them when I met them before Christmas, and I've met them intermittently since January. We could not have done what we did for the last number of years without them. But by the same token, Deputy Brady, we could not have done what we did in the last 5 years without Tuaisnua and CTEC, or CE, or TUS, or RSS, or SOLAS with regard to our training, or all of the back to educational grants that came from the Department of Education to allow people to go back to full-time colleges. No two people who are looking for work have the same set of challenges in their lives, and so therefore the services that we offer on behalf of the state have to be wide and varied, but tailored to meet the next generation of services, and they also absolutely have to be scalable, so that, God forbid, if anything happens, that we can scale them up. The specific questions. John, you are right, and it is outside of the generational services offering that we're working on at the moment. And I suggested when I think I was here last week that what we need to do is to look at an interdepartmental body that will specifically look from 0 to 66 at the challenges the kind of people that you're talking about are facing on a daily and a weekly basis, and specifically tailor cross-departmental targeted approach to those particular geographical black spots. Because I don't think we can tailor say 5 services from activation, educational experience perspective and capture all of the challenges of the families that you're talking about. So I think it needs more. And once this is done, I think that should be a priority of where we move on to.
Needs a minister to lead it.
Yeah, and I genuinely, and if I'm here long enough, I've no problem doing it, but I think if we get this body of work done in the next couple of months, I think then that's something either immediately after or in tandem with. I think we need to look at putting a cross-departmental task force together to look at a specific geographical area, take it as a proof of concept pilot and say if we can work with these 1,000 people and get better outcomes within 12 months, then it's a model for us to move forward. And I'm certainly willing to do that, that's no problem. And I think maybe if we could work between now and the National Action Plan for Inclusion is being launched in May to develop some sort of a pilot model, I think that would be a great time to launch it and to talk about it. You mentioned, Chair, about a new programme. It's not a new programme. We have a range of services that are on offer by a range of contractors at the moment. I would like us to tweak. Some of them are absolutely fabulous. Some of them can be better because of the skill set that they have and to reach people where we've never reached before. I think we need to enhance and empower the services. So it's not a new range of programmes, because we're not getting rid of yeses or over 55s or CE or TUS or RSS, but I think there is tweaking with regard to specific challenges in specific areas that we could do to enhance the offering that we have, and that's what I hope to be able to do in the coming months with the Department and our team. Senator Higgins, you talked about the way we measure outcomes. And again, there isn't a metric that's used for you, that's used for Jed, that's used for Johnny. The outcome is providing a pathway back to work and to having a sustainable and happy and fulfilling life for the people that we need to serve. And you are right, there are some people on the Live Register who need a much more holistic wraparound service to help them get from where they are to where we want them to go to. And for some people it might take 3 years, for some people it might take 7 years. But it can only be determined by the person's willingness to work and cooperate with the services, assuming those services are tailored to that person's set of needs, and we can work with those people. So measuring outcomes is not going to be the same for CE than it is for TUS, than it is for JobsPath, than it is for LESs, for our Jobs Club. The measuring of the outcomes is in the fulfilment of the person's requirements. And as you said earlier on, for some people that might be just learning how to have a capacity to understand that you need to get up every day, show up, be in the same place, ready for work. I might have to teach you how to train the skills to learn, or a different language or whatever, but for some people they will have a specific set of requirements in day 1. By year 2 they might have a different set of requirements, year 3, and different factors and different outcomes for different level of services are what's required to get people from where they are, which is long-term unemployed, into long-term sustainable supported employment. And that range of services will be designed over the coming months and tweaked with what we have already to make sure that we fit and fill excuse me, all of the gaps that currently exist. And for us in our department, as the Live Register thankfully is coming down, and actually probably more importantly, the long-term Live Register is coming down at a much greater speed than our Live Register, but actually probably even more importantly at a much, much greater speed than our European counterparts. It allows us, with the capacity that we currently have in the system, reach people who are intergenerationally unemployed to address the issues that they have, reach people who are actually not on the Live Register but want to be working but just need access to the range of supports and educational opportunities that they don't currently have access to. So it will allow us to stretch our offering to reach a much wider audience. Now, that's just not, apple pie and love, because we're actually reaching a stage where we don't have enough people to fulfil the jobs vacancies that are being created by the economy. So it's as much in the country's interest to try and encourage people who are not working but not on the Live Register to try and participate in the economy at the same time, but again provide the services that we can to make sure that it's an easy journey and a supported journey for them. I think the most serious message that I hope I can get across today is that our services are not in competition with each other. And the fact that one has an outturn rate of 28% and the other has an outturn rate of 25% and somebody else has 9% and CE has 37%, it's not a competition, because each person's objective and the body of people that they're coming and assisting will have different needs. And so therefore, if we were to measure everybody that if they all got a job within 1 year, well then some of them would be absolutely excelling and some of them wouldn't, but it wouldn't take into consideration any of the challenges or the difficulties of the people that we're sending to the groups and the organisations. So for me, it isn't about a competition, it's about having an array of services that suits a particular person's needs at a particular time in their life. And as long as I can offer the full range of services that complements each other, but also anybody that presents to an Intrio office has a choice depending on where they're at and what social challenges or what other difficulties that they may have or barriers to employment, can find a niche for them at that suitable time and then progress or go straight into work depending on how successful they are. I think that will be a measure of success if we can get that right. And it's not going to be easy because, as I said, the people who are presenting have a variety of different issues that they need to, but it's our job to provide services at the best level that we can. I think the biggest message I'm hearing today is that your concern and your nervousness is over the public procurement. So I'll be very honest with you and be very brutal. The EU procurement rules applies to everybody except those services that it doesn't apply to. And the legislation, as advised to me by both the CSSO and the Attorney General, is that much and all as you would want and they would want, the ILDN, our LESs and our Jobs Club do not come under that derogation, and so therefore they have to be attributable to the EU procurement laws, as does everybody else in the country. But that's not something to be afraid of. It's not something to be fearful of. And if that's the only thing that you're telling me, even though it's not necessarily a very large message that we're getting from the interactions that we're having with the people from Les and from Jobs Club, if that's the only thing that you're concerned about, then you genuinely have nothing to be concerned about, because our offering and our job is to provide for the 77,000 people who are long-term unemployed, the 45,000 people who are on CE who want to be able to progress into sustainable employment, and all of those hundreds of thousands of other people who are not on the live register but potentially could be in employment with the proper services. There is absolutely so much work to be done, and at such a tailored and detailed level, requiring, because of the different challenges that people are facing today and will face in the future, that we couldn't offer the services that we will intend to offer the far too many people that are unemployed without the procurement of the LESs and the Jobs Clubs, to make sure that we continue to use their expertise and their employment skills going forward. And that's when we tailor the plans that we have, or the models that we have. Well, then we will go, and they won't be the same. So there will be some, that will be looking for a certain type of service, and there'll be others that will be looking for a different type of service. There absolutely will be a place in future for all of our service providers. The specific question that you asked me, Deputy Brady, was do I intend to contract JobsPath in the future? What I intend currently to do is to fulfil the contract that we have, which runs up to 2021, and where we will decide what happens in the future is totally dependent on where the outcome and the deliberations that we will have with each other over the coming weeks as to what kind of services that we need to offer. But what I would ask you to just ponder on is that the 48,000 people who got work in the last number of years because of JobsPath did so because of that particular model. I don't know how many of them would have got jobs without that help, but what I'm absolutely sure of is that we did not have the capacity in our system, our current offering of our own offices and the current service providers that we had before 2015, to look after those people. We were incredibly stretched, which is why we introduced the new Intrio model, which is why we introduced contracting services on a paid-for-performance model, because it's what works in international best practice as part of a mix of services, not the only, and absolutely will never be the only. So with regard to what we will do, there are 48,000 people currently going through JobsPath. We have a responsibility to them, and we'll fulfil the contract with JobsPath before we make decisions in the next couple of weeks as to what the next generation of services will look like. Sorry, Jed, you talked about if we were wedded to tendering, could I give you a timeline? Again, I can't. So we're in breach of the EU legislation. Currently, we have been for the last number of years. What I want to absolutely do is, I'm not rushing to next Tuesday say, there's the tender. First of all, we need to know what we're tendering for. And I can't do that specifically until we know exactly what kind of services and the range of services that we want to. We will be working in cooperation with the LESs and over the next couple of months to find out what extra capacity and what extra skill set they have that we hadn't heretofore been utilising. And I think you alluded to some of that, Alice Mary, when you were talking about it. All I know is that when we decide in the next couple of months exactly what the best level of service offerings that we need to give the next generation of training, employment services and activation services to the next generation of Irish unemployed people, then we will work with the services that we have to allow them to consider which ones that they want to actually work with and fulfil going forward. So it's not going to be years away, but it's not going to be weeks away either. I mean, we need to make sure that we get it right, that it is for a next generation. It isn't just for the next couple of years, that the services that we offer are based on the experiences that we have today, the reduced number of people on the live register, but the extra capacity that we have in the current system to extend just the services that we currently offer, and indeed future services that we offer to people that heretofore we would have never offered them beforehand. I think that's answered.
Minister, you might think you're finished, but you're not. A number of colleagues have indicated they have supplementary questions. So I would ask colleagues to keep the questions as specific as you can to the Minister. We've made some very general statements on how to, but I'll start with Senator Higgins, if you don't mind. She indicated first, Deputy Brady, and then yourself.
Thank you, Minister. I'm just going to go straight to the procurement question. Again, I think that there is a case to be made in terms of but I accept that this is the route that you are looking at. In that regard, I'm looking at, for example, in relation to the SICAP process, whereby it was restricted to not-for-profit and other other services in that regard. Is that a capacity that is within the tendering process? Because I am very, very serious when I speak about there are spaces, especially spaces where human services, where not-for-profit is in fact better able to be responsive to that range of outcomes, and as you say, and I welcome that you said the idea of the choice of the person who's been assisted. So in that regard, on that, and again, where you would see quality, what weighting would be given to quality in relation to if you do pursue this procurement process. We know that relation to job training, for example, or quality of training of staff was quite a low weighting within that process. It's really vital that there's a high weighting given to quality and to different quality measures, and that's different from the pay per performance. That's a different thing, that's about the outcome. Absolutely. But in terms of the quality, in terms of the responsiveness, and again, with JobPath, we saw the scaling very quickly moving up. And lastly then, in that regard, one space that you certainly have freedom within the European procurement directives is when you don't go to tendering, but in terms of Intrio's internal capacity. Is there a potential for, or are there plans for increasing Intrio's own staffing levels, and perhaps in some of the ongoing cohorts or ongoing work, increasing the internal and ongoing capacity of the services to support our citizens? And perhaps HAP that's an issue. We talked about hard to reach groups who are maybe precluded from payments because of HAP, not HAP, sorry, you know what I meant, a habitual residency condition. Maybe they may also be able to, that kind of question of voluntary access.
Thank you, Senator. Deputy, if you bear with me, maybe I'll let the Minister answer those specific questions first, and then I'll take you.
I was just going to ask you, could I? So, first of all, I'd have to tell you that SICOP was an open competition tendering process, so it adheres to the EU procurement rules. And actually, if I'm to be honest, I think there are lessons that we can learn from how that tendering process was done before we go out to our own tendering process. Again, it is all about outcomes. And it has to be across every single scheme, because ultimately the aim for us is to get somebody into long-term, sustainable, supported employment. But it isn't a race. And so different services will have different speeds, for want of a better word, depending on the support that they're offering, depending on the type of services that they're offering, depending on the people that they're serving. So, it might take one service a year to help somebody get a job. It might take another service 3 years. It might take somebody to go from one service to another service and 5 years collectively to get trained before they can be in an employment. It's not about how quickly we get somebody into the outcome. It's about providing a service that's tailored for that particular person's needs and supporting them through that journey back into full-time sustainable employment, no matter how long it takes. That has to be the aim. And it definitely and absolutely has to be an acknowledgement that one kind of service or one type of service doesn't fit everybody's requirements, which is why we need a broad spectrum of services provided by a different range of people. And to specifically answer your question with regard to increasing our Intrio offices, the answer is no, given that because our live register numbers are coming down, I suppose the premise would be from DEEPR is that we should be reducing our overall staff count, not increasing them. But again, we have enough capacity in the system currently. I don't think we need to employ any more. We have, between our jobs, our LESs, our jobs clubs, our own Intrio case officers and the case officers that we have in JobsPath, we have just under 800 individual case office managers, which I think is sufficient on the ratio of 120 to 1, which is international best practice, of getting the best outcomes.
And just on the quality weighting. And the quality weighting, and also will education be a recognised outcome?
Again, it very much will depend on the service that you're contracting for. So we will design the tender based on the service that's required. And if the service has a higher wraparound services required, well then it's not going to be the same kind of a tender for somebody that we just want to help you get work experience or somebody that we just want to help you get training. There absolutely has to be an acknowledgement that different people are going to be travelling at different speeds, but the supports have to be there to enable them to feel supported and empowered all the way through that journey, no matter how long it takes them. Okay?
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Brady.
Just a couple of queries there, just around the procurement, just to follow up on a couple of points made by the senator there, and she's right in terms of the SICAP tendering, and it was actually approved by the Attorney General. I'm told that it was restricted to non-profit companies. Now, you say there's lessons that you may take out of that. I'd like to know what you think that the lessons are, because certainly it did achieve what it set out to do. It was an open tendering process, but it did restrict those who could and couldn't tender for it. And you're saying nobody should be afraid of the tendering process. Nobody is, but it's on what grounds? Because if the tendering process is a tender, payment by results, that is something to be fearful of. If it is open up to the private for profit companies, that is something to be very, very fearful of. When these private companies are more concerned about their shareholders and meeting those, I suppose, demands, as opposed to the demands of the individuals that they're supposed to be looking for. So there is something to be fearful of the tendering process, how it is actually going to be put in place. But I'm not convinced that we are bound by EU guidelines to go down that process. So again, I'd ask the question as to whether the advice that you have been given, whether you could actually circulate it to the committee members here, because certainly the information I have is completely contradicts that. So if we could get that. Just in relation to, again, I'm not going to get into an argument on it. We may have to agree to disagree on this.
Deputy Brady.
There is competition there. Clearly there is competition, and we've have evidence there from people within the LES, people within other services there, whether it's adult guidance services or whatever, that people who had been engaging with those had then subsequently been referred over to JobPat, ultimately to end up back at that start point 12 months later. So essentially taken out of things that had been working, whether it was in training, whether it was education, and put essentially sitting in front of a computer screen for 12 months, ultimately to find themselves back linked in with the LES. And we know there clearly is difficulties there within CE schemes, and I cited that already in my opening address. The amount of vacancies within CE schemes, the length and breadth of the state. Now you said, and you didn't really touch on it, that there's 800 staff across all of those services, including JobPat. And you said back in 2015 when JobPat was rolled out, there wasn't, I suppose the room there to scale up the existing services, the likes of the LES and that. Now is the time to actually start scaling up the LES, the job clubs, because there's a distinct difference in terms of the staff, and I'm not going to slate any staff, whether they're in Torresnua, CTEC or anywhere, they're all doing a job. But I think the level of training that the staff and the LES have and job clubs is second to none, and there is a massive turnover, very high turnover of staff within Torresnua and CTEC, and that has a serious impact on the type of delivery that they're able to give people that are linked in. So I think there is an opportunity now to actually upscale. If we're all in agreement that things have to change, now is the time to start looking at scaling up the 23 LESs that are out there, the jobs clubs that we all agree are actually working. Because I am not convinced people engaged in, with Torresnua and CTEC. We'd argue all afternoon here on how successful it is, Minister, but by and large, the vast majority of people who have got jobs would have got jobs one way or another. There's an awful lot of people who are further away from the workforce, who have effectively been sat in front of a computer screen, not just for 1 year, 2 years, but now 3 years, and ultimately probably will find up linked in with the LES later on. Now, you didn't answer the question just around the future of job, Pat. We know the contract. Well, you said 2021, we'll look at it at that point, but the actual contract, I know there's a 2-year run-off period, but it is that the contract itself is up this year with a 2-year run-off, and you say that you want to see through, what was it, the 48,000 people who are engaged there at this stage. So you're not going to make any decisions around the future of job, Pat, up until 2021.
We'll afford the Minister an opportunity to answer. Does that conclude your questions?
That's it for now.
Minister, there were a couple of specific questions.
Sorry, just one more before the Minister comes in. Apologies, and just to go back to the procurement as well. If the Minister does push ahead with the open tendering, the condition that was put in for JobPath, the 20 million condition that was put in for JobPath, used in the open procurement, is that something? If the Minister is intent on going down that route, will that 20 million condition be part of that tendering process? Because if it is, I will have serious concerns around that.
Can I just clarify that, Chair, before I go ahead?
Yeah.
Are you specifically relating to any future tender for jobs path type activities? Is that what you mean with the 20 million?
No. For if you go out for public procurement for
Gotcha.
the LES
That's fine.
and
Yeah, sorry, I understand you now.
Okay. Minister, there were a number of issues there in terms of the tendering and so forth.
So if I go back to start off with regard to SICAP, SICAP was an open competition public tender. When I mentioned that there was lessons that we could learn from it, what I meant by that is that maybe the structure of the tender, the lot size, the awarding criteria, I think it was an interesting process that we have learnt from and obviously will feed into and take cognizance of when we look at doing our own tendering process. The only people that give me advice as a Cabinet Minister, Deputy Brady, is the CSSO and the AG, and I'm bound by their advice, and their advice tells me that there are no derogations with regard to public procurement EU legislation and my ambition for publicly tendering for service offerings. And so I will be taking that advice, and as normal, I certainly won't be issuing copies of the advice as advice to me and the Cabinet, but I'm bound by that advice, and I actually agree with the model and the reasons behind what they've given me the advice for. If I go back to tell you again that there is no need to be fearful, because the amount of services that we need to offer the people of the future generations, the 77,000 people who are currently long-term unemployed today, the 42,000 people who are on CE, and anybody else who wants to work that's not currently on the live register, there's absolutely more than enough for the service offering that we have today, before we even tweak it, to continue using the contractors that we have into the future. The ambition that we have is to tailor and tweak the services that we are currently offering to suit the requirements and the needs of people who are not being fulfilled in every way that they could be today, but also to recognise that the challenges that are faced by future unemployed people will be slightly different than what they have been heretofore. For about a year, Deputy Brady, when I was Minister for Social Protection, there was many cases brought to me that the reason, and the sole reason, that we have a demise in our CE applications was because of JobsPath. We changed the legislation last June, to allow anybody who's on on JobsPath to be part of a CE scheme programme if that's what they wanted to do. And yet, coincidentally today, we still have quite a large number of vacancies on our CE schemes today, yet there are no restrictions to anybody on JobsPath applying for and participating in a CE scheme if that's what they want to do. And so I can only conclude from that that the tens of thousands of people that were presented to me that were on JobsPath that apparently wanted to do CE have either gotten jobs as part of the 40-something thousand people who got work, or they're quite happy to continue with JobsPath because they haven't made the applications in the kind of numbers that you and your colleagues would have presented to me heretofore. We do have an issue with regard to CE placement at the moment, and if you think that it's as simple as saying we have thousands of people on the live register and thousands of vacancies in CE, that we can just make people go to CE. That's not the way we work. So people have to apply for CE jobs, and they can only do that if that's what they want to do. We're certainly not in the business of making people apply for work experience if that's not what they want to do. What we're in the business of doing is recognising that no one size service is going to fit everybody's needs, and we're going to tailor over the coming weeks and months a range of services that will be sufficient to provide a level of service, support, activation, encouragement, mentoring, training, anything that's required to help people to get who are out of work, either in the short term, the medium term or the long term, that they have a state service that they can go to, that they will fit in nicely and be able to work with at the stages of their unemployment to get them back into long-term, sustainable, supported employment. And that's what we're going to develop and design over the coming weeks and months. You also mentioned, Deputy Brady, that we have taken people off educational courses and training schemes and put them onto Jobs Path, and that's absolutely categorically not true. If somebody is in training or in an educational scheme or doing a course in college, they don't appear on the live register. And the absolutely only people that we send to Jobs Path are people who've been on the live register, either underemployed or unemployed for more than 12 months. And also, you made a comment with regard to now we should beef up the amount of people that we send to LESs and Jobs Path. The reason that we have the outcomes that we have and the expertise and the level of, I suppose, excellent service that we get is because we're actually below what would be best practice from a ratio of, we'll call them clients for want of a better word, with regard to the case management team that we have in our LESs and our Jobs Club. International best practice tells us that an optimum level of number, no more than 120 clients to any one service case officer. At the moment, we're probably in and around 100 with all of our contracted services, including our own Intrio people. We have the capacity to scale that up by about 20, but I have no doubt that when we actually start offering services to people who are, have a disability and are not in the live register, for people who are in jobless households but are registered as qualified adults as opposed to being on the live register, we will have more than enough people to move that number, that ratio average number, from 100 to 1 up to the 120 to 1. But if you're suggesting that I should overload the LESs and give them 200 to 1, the absolutely only thing that would happen is that they would be overwhelmed and they wouldn't be able to offer the level of service that they have been able to do for the last number of years. We have a capacity of 800 case managers in this country. We need each and every single one of them, and we have no intentions of making the services any less than what they are, particularly at a stage in the country's cycle of where we're actually going to try and expand the range of people that we offer those services to.
Thank you, Minister. I just want to make one comment, Minister. First of all, in relation to the whole issue of open tendering and obviously complying with EU regulations and so forth, I respect the fact that you advised from the Attorney-General, and as anybody who's sat on that side of the House, that advice isn't shareable, and I understand that fully. But you hit on a point that's very accurate and very true, and it doesn't just apply to what you're involved in, but it applies everywhere. The very nature and the type of tendering, the type of tender that you seek, influences the outcomes. And that's really, really important. And in that regard, Minister, as you're designing that process, I'm hoping that you might be in a position to keep this committee informed of what you're thinking and what you're progressing. Because that tender process, it's not the open tender that's the issue. It's how the tender is structured will determine the outcome. And I'd like that this committee might have some input and some oversight and some view of that process as it develops. I think that would be really useful. I thought you were finished.
No.
Can I just answer you though?
Yes, Minister.
I hear you loud and clearly. I'm not sure that I can come back mid-tender design, but I hear you loud and clear.
You understand?
I do, absolutely. Yeah.
Deputy Brady.
No, just on the procurement process. Now, you didn't answer a couple of questions that I had around the 20 million condition that was used for Job Path as to whether, and I appreciate, you know, you may not have started looking at putting in place the tender or anything like that, but there would be massive concern around that. Also, I questioned the whole issue around the payment by results as to whether that is something that you were considering. Again, I'd have massive concerns around that. And again, to go back to the EU guidelines, and I know you're saying you cannot share the information that the Attorney-General has given, but again, I would make reference to the SICAP tenders that the Attorney-General actually gave that the go-ahead. And if you have a look at the services of general interest, and I quoted from it here earlier on, expressly include services provided directly to the person, such as social assistance services, employment and training services. So there's specific mention of those services within the services of general interest. So, you know, I firmly believe that, you know, we can do this without having to go out, you know. So I'm not going to give up on
let
that.
the Minister, you've asked those very directly. No, let the Minister answer them. The 20 million, the
20 million didn't form any part of the SICAP tendering process.
No.
No,
Job
so
pat was
Yeah, and there was a specific reason it was in that tendering process. But you're asking me, is it going to form part of all future tendering processes in the future? And I can't tell you that it will form part of all future tendering processes in the future. But I can't rule out that it will form part of some. And what I'm explaining to you is that the payment by results model, which is the one that you fear the most.
We're talking about the LES and job clubs, is going to form part of.
But I've already told you that we haven't designed the tender process because we haven't designed the services requirement. And so you want to put the cart before the horse.
I'm just asking, is that
No,
something
that's
that
what
you
you
were
want. You
considering?
want me to answer a question about something. Have we designed and had specific recommendations or conditions in a tender when we don't even know what we're tendering for? And so to answer the specific question that you have an issue with the payments by results model, it's a particular model that has its own merits, but it's only one model. And based on the range of people that we need to serve, we need many models. And so it isn't, and I don't know how many times I have to say this before you'll actually acknowledge the bona fides of what we're trying to do here, is that I'm not trying to send everybody to JobsPath. There are some people that it doesn't suit. There are some people who we haven't even reached yet that it won't be preferable to send them to until or before we send them to other levels of supports and services. So if your fear is that everybody is going to be disbanded in the morning and the absolute only thing we're going to have is JobsPath, then you have absolutely nothing to worry about. JobsPath is a very successful model that we use in this country, but it's only one model because we have hugely successful other models that we've continued to work with that are full of experience, expertise, advice, empathy. There are a huge amount of different models that are currently working exceptionally well in this country. And we need to tweak some of them for this generation. We need to enhance others. We need to move to multi-annual contracts so that people are not worrying whether they get their money next year or the year after the year. What we're trying to do is to improve the range of models and services that we're offering. Not undermine anybody, not threaten anybody, not give anybody the willies. We're trying to improve the level of services that's on offer by the state, recognising the complete level of requirement and the changing requirements that the people that we serve have today. That's all we're trying to do.
Senator Higgins.
Nothing to be scared of.
Had you another?
Yes, it's very specific. So again, I would concur with what the Chair was saying. It would be very useful if we could at least give some thoughts into that process because I think it's very important. I would like, if, we've already made the case around services of general interest, but in terms of when we talk about quality, and one of the issues again was in terms of outcomes, there was the specific one around education, because I know, Minister, you described people may move through a service, it may take 5 years and 6 years, but if it's a 2-year or a 3-year contract, and if you are looking at what the outcomes will be, I just want to be assured that, for example, if somebody moves through a local employment service and then they start a 3-year degree, that it's not going to translate into employment maybe within the period of time of a particular contract, but that it's recognised as an outcome. And that's kind of what I was saying about, in terms of measuring outcomes. And I know that the long-term goal, but as you acknowledge yourself, it may be sometimes because people are very distant, sometimes because people have ambition to travel a great distance. Yeah. It can be so that, a movement out of effectively your remit and into the remit of long-term education or, a primary degree or whatever will be recognised. And so that was that key issue there for me, really. And it would be very useful to be able to give an input. And then finally, just that issue I had raised in my initial submission around things like just transition. Multi-annual contracts are really important, but it's also important that those contracts are able to be flexible and respond, for example, to the collapse of an industry because of Brexit, because of climate change, whatever it might be. If you know what I mean. So, and I know new contracts will be needed, but there may be, we know that there's been situations where we've had almost sectoral crises and areas where there's been a huge cohort of persons who may be in danger of becoming unemployed. So that issue that I mentioned at the very beginning around, again, be it Brexit, be it climate change, the at-risk of employed, let us say.
I think with respect, and I know exactly where you're going with that particular comment, you're now talking about moving into people who are pre-unemployed. Yeah. I think we have enough unemployed people, to be honest with you, to try and provide services before we ever move into the pre-unemployment. people who are in precarious or vulnerable situations, I think we need to empower through stronger legislation. We've done that in the last couple of weeks with the advent of the Miscellaneous Employment Provisions Bill starting in March. I would be more open to putting in more strenuous legislation to ensure people's employment rights in the jobs that they have, as opposed to trying to assist them get the next job from the job that they're already in.
I mean, just transition may be an issue that
Yeah.
we may have to discuss separately, because it will come in the next decade, say. It will become an issue. But we can plan for that as much.
Maybe after we get this level of services out of the way,
Sure.
we could have a conversation about that. But it is genuinely moving then into a next level. And if I'm to be honest with you, the people that I need to concentrate on in the very near future are our jobless households, are our people who are registered nowhere except as an independent qualified adult, but potentially have a huge valuable contribution to play in either the social economy or the real economy, but just have never been offered supports. You know, we get this a lot from women, is that they just never were asked, you know, and they have a huge, and actually most of them are already working in the social economy in our volunteering agencies in our towns and villages. Yes. But you're touching on a model with regard to the lessons on outcomes. We don't currently model the service on outcomes, and I think we should. And I don't mean outcomes as in you've got a target of getting X amount of people a job, because I would actually envisage that the wraparound services that could be on offer from our LESs in the future would be far more holistic about getting people on the road to recovery as opposed to getting them a job. So outcomes can be measured in a variety of ways and should be measured in a variety of ways, and I think that's something that we could potentially look at in the very, very near future, because at the moment we don't really do outcomes with our LESs or our CEs. And it's not to put people under pressure by giving them outcome targets, but it's just to make sure that we can see people moving and progressing through either a range of services that are on offer, or maybe moving from education into employment, or moving from, you know, upskilling and confidence building into education, then, you know, but we just to see a progression over the range of services. And so I would be very keen to move to an outcome level, but not to put any fear factor in that it isn't a performance
payment by
outcome,
results
because
kind of dynamic.
what might be a successful outcome for me might be a different measure or metric of a successful outcome for you, but I think we need to be cognizant of all of those metrics.
Minister, thank you very much. That more or less concludes it. I would just ask you, in terms of, and I don't expect you to answer now, we did raise the issue with you about, you know, what insight this committee might have in terms of, you know, the policy formation that will underpin, I suppose, the tendering process. You might, and your officials might send the committee a note on what would be possible. I obviously understand in terms of tender, it's a legal process and so forth. But some of the issues that were raised and the type of tender, you know what I'm trying to get at. Obviously, the type of tender, how it's structured, the criteria, very much affects who can apply for it, who it's suited, and the type of company or organisation that may or may not apply. You might send us a note on what you think would be possible from yours and the department's point of view of keeping this committee informed as to the progress you're making in that regard.
I think that would be no problem.
At this stage, Minister, thank you very much for your attendance today. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you very much, everybody.
We will adjourn until 9:45 on Thursday, the 11th of April. Thank you very much.